Today on Ag News Daily.
And we're getting into that season where they should have booked a lot of their soybeans already for this fall quarter. So if we don't get any business from China, that's going to make the balance sheet pretty tough. So the soybean market could still see a lot of volatility in either direction depending on how all those factors play out.
Well, welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily Show. You know, this coffee mug, the logo's not great to hold while you drink it, but you know who's in Ireland this week?
It's a big week. I wanted to be at the game this week. I'm really sad.
I think we've got listeners in Ireland, so if you are, send us a message. But back home, let's talk weather. Iowa's Crop Health Index, known as the NDVI, slipped this week after 5 straight weeks with record highs. That comes as parts of Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska are seeing one of its 5 wettest late summer periods in more than a century. Disease pressure's high, it remains high, and repeated severe weather has hit the Corn Belt. Yields impacted from hot, humid nights are still uncertain, but for context, Indianapolis has already logged 39 nights above 70 degrees, which is more than double the normal. Good news, though, cool down is on the way. A strong cold front will bring much lower temperatures this weekend and into next week, making it feel more like fall and easing some of the stress on crops in drier areas. While the front missed parts of Missouri through Ohio earlier this week, another system is expected today into the weekend. It may not bring much rain, but it will deliver a significant drop in temperatures. Here across the plains, that same front will stall out to the south, where heavy rain is likely next week. Overall conditions remain mostly favorable across much of the region, thanks to regular rainfall. The dry pockets in the southern and eastern Midwest will still need some moisture to help crops finish strong. 2 key weather stories ahead. A deepening low over Ontario this weekend will drag that cold front across the U.S., which will bring those scattered storms into the plains and into the Midwest, while the eastern Corn Belt, Mid-South, and Delta will stay drier. There's also Hurricane Erin hitting a Category 5 strength in the Atlantic, and another tropical wave has 60% chance of developing, with some models steering it closer to Florida and the Gulf, though there is some uncertainty. Hopefully that storm stays away from land.
We do not need more rain, so they can keep it down there in Florida. The USDA's latest crop condition report showed mixed changes again this week. Corn rated 71% good to excellent, down 1% from last week. Progress near average, with 97% silking, 72% in the dough stage, and 27% dented. Soybeans hold steady at 68% good to excellent, with 95% blooming and 82% setting pods, both in line with the 5-year average. Winter wheat harvest is 94% complete, just shy of the 95% average for this time of year. Spring wheat, meanwhile, is 50% good to excellent, up 1% from last week, with 36% harvested, also near the seasonal average. And crop tour kicked off, Tanner.
That's right, and Iowa could be the nation's leader in both corn and soybeans this year, but crops are racing against this mounting disease pressure. Lead scout Chip Flory called Northwest Iowa fields the best and the worst he has ever seen, with southern rust showing up in many of those. Scouts noted consistently strong beer counts, ear length, and kernel rows across multiple districts, with some areas setting record measurements. Illinois corn looks lush from the road, but scouts reported only an average crop once they stepped into the fields. Corn yields near 196.2 bushel per acre, down slightly from last year, but above the 3-year average. Poor emergence was a factor in some of these samples. Soybeans told a brighter story, though, with pod counts averaging 1,479 per 3x3 square, which was 4% better than last year and 12%, Delaney, above average.
Well, looking at South Dakota, they showed major improvements this year, with corn yields estimated at a 174, up 11% from last year. Soybeans also surged, with pod counts averaging about 1,188 per 3x3 square, nearly 16% higher than last year. Pod counts per row climbed 20% year over year, and moisture conditions were much better than in 2024, giving crops here probably a stronger finish. Ohio is also setting records of its own. This year's corn yield came in at a 185.7, slightly above last year and topping the tour's previous record. Soybean pod counts were even stronger, though scouts caution that limited moisture could limit the crop's ability to fully finish.
Yeah, and Indiana's crop showed some unevenness due to those wet spots we talked about, with some smaller kernels and shorter grain fill length. However, a higher ear count will help boost overall yields, putting Indiana ahead of Nebraska in corn potential. Soybeans were also above average, keeping the pace with the strong results that came across that eastern corn belt. After years of drought, Nebraska crops are benefiting from abundant moisture, so much so that the scouts reported mud on their boots. Corn and soybean yields there are trending 8% to 10% higher than the past 2 years, thanks to those better growing conditions. Still, it's noted pocketfuls of weeds and disease pressure, along with some green snap and tipback in corn there. I know a lot of my friends in Nebraska didn't have to irrigate as much. Mother Nature took care of that.
Well, we're going to talk about those crop reports in markets later in the episode here, but a report from the American Soybean Association says America's soybean farmers are nearing a financial cliff and won't survive another drawn-out trade war with China, one of the world's, of course, largest soybean buyers. Caleb Ragland, president of the American Soybean Association, sent a letter to the White House urging the administration to reach a deal with China to remove the duties and, if possible, to include significant soybean buys. He said, quote, U.S. soybean farmers can't survive a prolonged dispute with our largest customer. Soybean farmers are under extreme financial stress as prices drop and costs for inputs and equipment continue to climb. In a response, Bloomberg article headlined U.S. soybean farmers near financial precipice due to tariffs. The White House said the president cares about farmers. Ragland's letter points out that China hasn't purchased any U.S. soybeans for months ahead of America's quickly approaching harvest. With no deal between the U.S. and China, the extra bushels will make a bad situation worse. China has historically imported more than 60% of the world's total soybean supplies, with the U.S. once serving as its top source, but now retaliatory tariffs make U.S. soybeans about 20% more expensive than South American supplies, and China has turned to Brazil, which has expanded production to meet that demand.
Even with all that pressure, farmland values in the Central Farm Belt rose 3% during the second quarter of 2025. This is now compared to a year before, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, which they showed here earlier in August. USDA's latest land values report from earlier in August also shows that U.S. farm real estate averaging $4,350 an acre, up $180 since last year, marking the fifth consecutive annual increase. Cash rent cropland climbed by a record $171 an acre, while pasture rents held steady. This annual report provides one of many indicators of the overall health of the ag economy. The pace of growth, however, is slowing compared to the rapid run-up earlier in the decade. Analysts are saying the cooling could cause pressure on buyers, but also limit producers' ability to leverage land as collateral for loans. Record rental rates also add to costs for renters, while lenders may grow more cautious in those values stagnant. The land values, though, are still rising. Slowing pace signals the market cooling from rapid appreciation earlier this decade. Regionally in Michigan, it led the nation with 7.8% jump in farm real estate values, followed by Tennessee, South Dakota. Cropland values saw the sharpest increases in Utah, Michigan, and Tennessee, while the highest overall values still remain in California. The northeast parts of Florida, where specialty crops are made, that drives their demand. Unlike cropland and overall farm real estate, pasture land values are the highest along the East Coast and in the Mid-South, where development pressures, land scarcity, and lifestyle contribute to those elevated prices. As the USDA prepares to release their updated income forecast that comes out on September 3rd, this data will underscore a key tension. Land values remain strong, but long-term farm profitability is increasingly resilient and reliant on policy, not price.
Well, we'll have to get Dave, the land guy from the Farm for Profit, on here soon to talk about that. But the U.S. Trade Representative's office has launched a Section 301 investigation into Brazil over what it calls unfair ethanol trade practices. American ethanol groups say Brazil's tariffs have left U.S. producers at a major disadvantage. Growth Energy says Brazil has long sought special access to the U.S. market while restricting U.S. ethanol through tariffs and other barriers. The Renewable Fuels Association points out Brazil now imports an 18% tariff on U.S. ethanol, while its own shipments enter the U.S. at just 2.5%. So certainly some concerns there over disadvantages.
There is, but Secretary Rollins says the USDA will no longer fund solar panels on farms. This is a new project at first. Secretary Rollins points to the rapid growth of subsidized solar farms, which she says would drive up land costs and reduce access of land to farmers. Tennessee lost more than 1.2 million acres in the last 30 years and is projected to lose another 2 million by 2027, according to the solar panels on farmland, which has climbed nearly 50% since 2012. The prime farmland should not be wasted and replaced with subsidized solar panels, Rollins said, adding that land access is one of the biggest challenges facing you and young farmers. She's not wrong there.
Well, turning our attention to other energy sources, Story County, Iowa is appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court in a dispute over the proposed carbon dioxide pipeline. Summit Carbon Solutions, based in Ames, Iowa, is planning, of course, a $9 billion pipeline to transport liquefied CO2 emissions from ethanol plants across several states to an underground storage site in North Dakota. Now, both Story and Shelby counties here in Iowa passed ordinances imposing stricter limits than state and federal laws where pipelines can be built. In June, however, a federal appeals court ruled that counties can't impose additional regulations that supersede federal and state laws. Story County's ordinance, adopted after Summit announced its project, prohibited CO2 pipelines within a quarter-mile of homes, city boundaries, expansion areas, and certain gathering places such as churches and golf courses. Both counties also required setbacks and permits for construction. Summit argued, and a federal district judge agreed, that the ordinances were preempted by federal pipeline safety standards, and now we'll see if that case will be taken by the Supreme Court, Tanner.
Yeah, it's interesting. Small state county in Iowa addressing the Supreme Court. Well, the USDA's mid-year cattle report points to fewer calves available for placement in late 2025 and early 26, with beef cow replacement heifer inventories showing only 8 gradual change themselves. That led the USDA to trim beef production forecasts for both years. Elsewhere, lamb prices jumped in June and July, prompting higher price forecasts into 2026. Milk production is projected to rise on larger herds and better yields, with all milk prices staying steady at $22 per hundredweight. Pork output is now pegged 1% lower than 2025 at 27.5 billion pounds. While broiler production is expected to climb on stronger hatchery data and cheaper feed. I think everywhere's got cheaper feed thanks to these suppressed grain prices.
Well, certainly not something we love to see. But here's some interesting headlines here to catch us up on New World screwworm. Secretary Rollins has announced the next initiative here to prevent that, as a new sterile fly facility will be put up in Edinburgh, Texas, producing 300 million sterile flies to help control the pest. USDA is also investing a $100 million in new technology, hiring mounted patrol tick riders at the border, training detector dogs to identify screwworm infestations. The agency says it will continue working closely with Mexican officials to prevent outbreaks from spreading north.
Dogs to identify screwworms.
That's quite something, isn't it?
Well, the U.S. government sues California over their emissions. The U.S. government has sued California to block that enforcement of those stricter emission standards for heavy-duty trucks. Ruling came from President Trump during his recently declared void. The Justice Department says federal law preempts California Air Resources Board from enforcing truck and emission standards rules, including its Clean Truck Partnership with manufacturers. The DOJ officials say California is blocking new vehicles from coming into their market unless they meet these states' preempted standards. Call it ongoing defiance of federal law. Reuters reports that California officials, including Governor Gavin Newsom's office, declined to comment on this story. Not sure what the outcome's going to be on that one.
A lot of concern and challenges between state and federal law here. A draft of upcoming MAHA reports have been attained by the New York Times, stops short of proposing direct limits on ultra-processed foods or pesticides. issues HHS Secretary RFK has called major threats to our food system. If adopted, the report would ease concerns in the food and agriculture industries, which feared stricter rules under Kennedy's Make America Healthy Again push. Instead, regulations will emphasize public confidence in existing pesticide reviews while supporting new research on ways to cut pesticides to use and study health impacts. But to Tanner, to lead us into our interview for today, I sat down earlier this week with Chief Commodities Economist Arlan Suderman. So let's get into that interview right now. Well, folks, it's been quite some time since we have had a market discussion. So who better to have that with than Arlan Suderman with StoneX, the Chief Commodities Economist. Arlan, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
It's good to be back with you, Delaney.
Absolutely. There's no shortage of topics to talk about today, certainly of which I think, WASDE was last week, but I think that's still fresh on the minds of folks being such a shell shocker of a report. What was your take on it?
Well, it was a shell shocker maybe to some. Obviously, it was very, very close to our estimate, and our estimate came from our customer survey. So that means there were hundreds and thousands of data points from across the Midwest that went into that. And that's what people across the Midwest told us what they saw in their area, all combined. Now that's a August 1 type of yield estimate, what it looks like August 1. That changes each month. That's what it looked like at that point. But I would also argue it wasn't surprise to the market think. They say, what does the market think? Today's markets are heavily driven by the funds who have algo computers putting in orders. If these funds have millions and millions of dollars invested, they're going to buy the best yield models that money can buy. They're going to develop the best yield models. I had seen some of those yield models ahead of time. That's why I put mine on in July to say, hey, this is what type of numbers are being traded out there, the funds. I would argue the market would have done the same thing on August 12th, whether USDA reported a yield or not, other than the acreage changes. Well, I was surprised. The market on August 12th, when USDA released the numbers, in my view, did not respond to the yield estimates, even though they were much bigger than the pre-report estimates, because that had already been priced in, because the funds were all trading these yield models that I was trying to show people. This is how the market is operating, whether we like it or not. That's how it's functioning. And so that's the only thing the market then traded after that was the surprise acreage changes. That was not foreseen. It did that for a day or two, and then it reconsolidated in a new trading range, and to wait to see if there's any evidence to could suggest that the crops could be bigger than what had already priced in. And frankly, we don't see that evidence at this point now, with the crop tour basically being done. And so the market's starting to shift its focus now to the demand side of the ledger.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting concept to wrap your head around with the algo high frequency models that you mentioned. From a farmer lens, they might be listening thinking, all right, well, the game's already over before it even starts for us. How does a farmer compete against, the computer models that are trading, to your point, at these high velocities? They are already pricing in the high yield, the acreage shift, as you talked about. How do we compete on that level?
It means that we have to access as much information as possible. And that's one reason I put information out there, is I want them to have the same information so they can respond and react to it as quickly as possible where appropriate. It means that we have to be much quicker to respond. But we all know the seasonal cycles that these markets tend to be on. It speeds all of that up. So we have to think on a quicker timetable as well, maybe quicker than what we're comfortable with. And so that means, what tools do we have out there that we can utilize? Crop insurance is one thing, the crop revenue insurance. It provides some downside revenue protection until October, essentially. We have to have protection beyond that. One of the most rewarding things for me was a farmer who reached out to me. I've never met him. And he said, because you put out that post in July, I put protection on, and that helped me. And so that was very rewarding for me to see that. We have to be prepared to use some of the tools. There's some over-the-counter tools out there. There are some cash tools. There are some derivative tools that can be used. We just have to become accustomed to them and how to use them on our farm situation. It's going to be different for everybody to try to make sure we're managing that risk in today's market environment that we may not like, but it is a reality of what there is.
So, Arlan, looking more current term, you mentioned that markets and the machines, the high frequency algos, had already taken into account the shift in acreage and yields. Looking at soybeans this week, though, we've seen double-digit moves on the board. We've seen that really climb here over the last few days. What is it that's pushing markets higher, if not the WASDE report that we got last week?
Yeah, the yield was factored in. The acreage was not. It did that. We saw the rally in soybeans because we have the much smaller acreage. And we all know that soybeans can still be impacted a lot, their yield potential in late August and early September. So we built some of that weather premium back in because of it. And then here the last couple of days, we've had a lot of rumors that the EPA was about to announce something on the small refinery exemptions. And we started seeing a lot of call options being purchased. And so the very fact that call options are being purchased, people start thinking, what do they know that we don't know? And so they start buying soy oil because soy oil prices had over the last few weeks been drifting lower again off of that late July high. And so that helped provide support for soy oil prices. And then soybeans benefited from that, along with corn and soybeans are both benefiting from the fact that the crop tour didn't find anything to suggest that the crops are any bigger than what had been priced in. And so it's a big sigh of relief buying here, the fund saying maybe it's time to cover some short positions, end users saying maybe it's time to add some coverage.
Well, chatting with some farmers last week at the Iowa State Fair, my husband included in that, the farmers that we did run into right after the WASDE was dropped, I think the question from a lot of them is, do we see this crop stay at this yield level? Does the crop remain big? Or does it get smaller from here? So I think that's the $1 million question that a lot of growers have, Arlan, is, are we going to actually see these yields come to fruition?
I'm glad you asked that question. I've always been one, and I've been in this business for over 4 decades, and I've always said big crops get bigger. So I went back and looked, does the data really show that? And so I looked at all the data going back to 1993, 32 years. That's all the further I had time to look back. Over that time, USDA has raised their corn and soybean yield estimate. Well, I'll start with corn. Raised their corn yield estimate 32 times. 17 times out of 32 years. Of those 17 years, it only got bigger, the final number, and I'm not just talking January, I'm talking about the following September when they revise it again when no one's watching. The final yield was only higher than that August estimate 5 times. It matched it 1 time, and it was lower 11 times. So big crops tend to get smaller. And the opposite was true as well. When they lower their estimate in August, the final yield tended to be higher than that August estimate. Small crops get bigger, not every year, but the majority of years. And so from that standpoint, just history says, it doesn't guarantee it, but it says the odds favor this crop's going to get smaller. Then you look at the weather, how we've really started to dry out across the Midwest, and we've had some periods of heat. Now we're moving into a milder time. We have some disease. We have some other issues there. The crop probably is getting smaller. How much is really going to depend on seed size for the most part at this point, and how we finish out that seed size. That'll determine our final yield, and is also how the disease impacts the crop, and that too affects seed size.
We might have to find a new adage then for you.
That's right.
But the markets, what are the markets trading? Do you think they're taking into effect some of that historical data like you mentioned?
Yeah, the market knows that. If they have millions and millions of dollars at stake, and some of these funds billions of dollars, they do their homework. They know the tendencies. They're doing that. The corn market and soybean market are very different right now. The corn market has strong demand. It's been focusing on what's the potential size of the crop, how big might it be. That's been priced in to a great extent, I would argue, and I believe was priced in even before the August 12th report. Now it's starting to focus on the supply, the demand side, with demand is strong. That doesn't mean we rally to $5 because the U.S. farmers undersold, the Brazilian farmers undersold, and so they're going to be selling rallies. We're certainly not going to be running out of corn, so there's no reason to ration demand with higher prices, but it does allow the market to come off those lows, and the funds like some volatility, so we'll get some movement that the farmers can then sell the rallies as they come. Soybean market, we still don't really know the total size of the crop. We can think, okay, it's probably not any bigger than what we've seen already, not much bigger. It could get smaller. But what about the demand side? That's the biggest question marks. We think domestic demand is going to be strong, but we still need to get a couple of rulings from EPA on the small refinery exemptions and then the final rulings on the RVOs, the blending mandates. So far, this Trump administration has been very farmer friendly in all of its biofuel decisions. So that's our bias that are going to be good, that domestic demand is going to be good. But exports is a big question mark. Will there be a trade agreement with China? I'm kind of pessimistic on that right now as I read the tea leaves and what's happening with China. They've been really working to try to fill their needs with South American soybeans, which are still available, and soy meal, which is available in Argentina. And they have not bought a bushel from us yet, with no records of them anyway, of buying a bushel from us yet. And we're getting into that season where they should have booked a lot of their soybeans already for this fall quarter. So if we don't get any business from China, that's going to make the balance sheet pretty tough. So the soybean market could still see a lot of volatility in either direction, depending on how all those factors play out.
Arlan, let's round out the discussion with a little bit of the fundamentals driving the wheat complex. What are you watching there?
First of all, some of the quality problems that we're seeing in the Black Sea, the Baltics, has been increasing demand for U.S. hard red and winter wheat. That's been a positive for our demand. We have seen stronger export sales than what USDA projected, and we continue to see that happening. We're watching the corn market. While the corn market was pulling new lows, that was weighing on wheat. Now that corn seems to possibly be forming a bottom, that helps wheat prices stabilize. Now it's a job of the market to try to make sure we have enough wheat acres for next year. We're seeing some dryness forecasts for the plains as well as some other northern hemisphere locations, including the Black Sea. So we'll be watching the weather forecast for those major wheat producing areas in the northern hemisphere to see if we can get ourselves a rally here to sell. Global exporters, supplies minus the United States, all the other major exporters, supply relative to demand is relatively tight, historically tight levels, but adequate to meet the demand. If we see any hiccups in those production areas, that can send the world back to the United States for supply. We don't know when that'll happen, if it'll happen, but that's what we're watching for.
Fantastic. Well, Arlan, if people aren't following you on X, they certainly should be. Give us your quick plug here for your X handle.
It's Arlan, ARLAN, FF101. And they can also follow my analysis on our StoneX YouTube channel.
Perfect. Well, Arlan, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Always appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Delaney.
Well, I'm glad you were able to cover that. And what news that was. Glad Arlan shared his insights. And I'm sure, even though I wasn't a part of it, he mentioned how right he was.
Well, watching his X account the last few weeks has been nothing short of entertaining, and we've all been in the limelight, being kind of in the podcasting and behind a microphone. We understand how sometimes shots get fired, so feel for him on that front, but always appreciate his insight. He was right at the end of the day. That's the thing.
What a good guest to have on, and I'm so glad that during this script you got the word precipice, because I don't think I would have read it directly.
I love it when Michelle throws in big words for you.
It should be all letters, no longer than 8. in my words. But go Cyclones. Tune on the game. Starts at 11 on Saturday. Also next week, I will be out at Farm Progress Show. Thank God Delaney's not coming. Come see me. Say hi. That was
That's okay. I kind of feel the same way, to be honest. I'm okay with it.
Yes, come swing by the John Deere booth or Stuka booth. Going to record a couple of News Daily interviews while we're out there. So follow along on social media. I appreciate you all as always. But Delaney, for today, what do you say?
Let's let them go.